All right, good morning, Master Class. It is April the 5th. We just had a great Easter weekend at the park and other places. I'm glad to see everybody. I know you've been waiting with bated breath to talk about Isaiah 16 through 25. I know that's high on your list of Bible verses that you want to study, but we'll see a few interesting things today. We're doing Isaiah 10 chapters at a time so that we don't get all hung up in what's going on there. You remember last time when we ended up, we talked about Isaiah was the prophet, the main prophet in the time of King Hezekiah and just before King Hezekiah. It's when the Assyrians were the dominant force in the area. Egypt was still a force, Babylon was still a force, but Assyria was the main force. And we're gonna start. So let's go ahead and turn to Isaiah 16. And Isaiah 16 is it's a continuation from Isaiah 15. And Isaiah 15, if you go back in Isaiah 15:1, he's giving a prophecy against Moab. So Moab was a neighbor of Israel. They were to the east of the Dead Sea. Moab was a traditional enemy. And we will be studying actually this Sunday about Moab. I've forgotten about that. So this Sunday we'll be talking about Moab a lot. So we'll be ready for this. But it's a traditional, at the time of Isaiah, traditional enemy. And starting in verse 16, it says, "Send lambs as tribute to the ruler of the land, from Selah across the desert to the mount of daughter Zion." So he's talking about sending a tribute from Moab to Jerusalem. That's what he's actually talking about. So after I get Don entered in.
What was that?
So he was talking about sending a tribute again from Moab to Israel. Does anybody remember a time when Moab sent tribute to Israel before? Anybody remember a time? So I'm going to kick out and go to some verses I looked up before, but King David, when you read, and I'm in First Chronicles 18:2, you don't need to turn to it, I'll just read it to you. It says, "David also defeated the Moabites, and they became subject to him and brought him tribute." So when David captured or defeated all of the countries around him, one of the main things they had to do was to send tribute to David, annual tribute. Okay, and that kept David from going in and hurting him worse. So through the centuries, that continued. They had to keep sending tribute. So now I'm going to move to 2 Kings 3, and we're talking further down the line in the kings. This is when Ahab was king of the northern kingdom. And it says, "Now Mesha, king of Moab, raised sheep, and he had to pay the king of Israel a tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams." So Moab was sending this huge tribute to Israel every year just to keep the peace. And then later we find out as the kingdoms weakened, Moab and the other countries quit sending tribute. So what Isaiah is prophesying about is a time when Moab will have to start sending tribute again. Okay, so that's a little background of that. Tribute, by the way, was a big deal. It's one of the main reasons I think David got so rich and Solomon. They had all of the surrounding countries paying these huge tributes to them. And when they quit paying, when Israel and Judah got a lot weaker and they quit paying tribute, it became a real problem because they had this big source of income that got cut off. Anybody ever had that happen to them where you thought you were in really good shape, had good income coming in, and then you lost a job or your stock fell apart or something? It's a real problem. So that was a problem in Israel, and that's what Isaiah is referring to, as Israel is in a bad way because these countries have quit throwing tribute. Then I'm going to drop down to Isaiah 16:5. In love, a throne will be established. In faithfulness, a man will sit on it. One from the house of David, one who is judging, seeks justice and speeds the cause of righteousness. So this is one of the key verses that the Israelites would have used to say that the Messiah will be from the house of David. Okay, so that's going to be verse 16:5 is one of the big messianic verses going there. Then I'll drop down to 17, chapter 17 of Isaiah. Verse 1, prophecy against Damascus. See, Damascus will no longer be a city, will become a heap of ruins. That would have been a big prophecy. Damascus is in Syria, as we know. Back then, it would have been, I'm not sure, probably part of Syria, but maybe part of Ammon too. When it says it will no longer be a city, that would have been a huge prophecy, because Damascus was the oldest continuously inhabited city of the time. So when he's saying Damascus is going away, that's a big deal. And so he's given a prophecy against Damascus. So as we've read through this, Isaiah is giving prophecies against countries and cities, against the enemies of Israel. And then go on down to prophecy 8, to chapter 18. Now this is a prophecy against Cush, which is the country to the south. Woe to the lands of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush, which sends envoys by sea and papyrus boats over the water. So Cush is just one of the other enemies. And down into verse 7 of chapter 18. At that time, gifts will be brought to the Lord Almighty from a people tall and smooth-skinned, from a people feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech, whose land is divided by rivers. The gifts will be brought to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord Almighty. So again, another fierce enemy was going to be brought under control. Now, what we're seeing here is a theme that's going to be a big theme as we keep moving along in some of our other studies. The Israelites are walking themselves into a really interesting situation that is going to play out in the time of Christ. They continually, as we've read in Isaiah and other places, God is going to come to power, and God is going to be the God of justice. He's going to make all things right. And as you read these, the Israelites continually become much more focused on the fact that, yeah, God's going to be in control, but it's to the benefit of Israel. Everything that God's doing is Israel's front and center. So the Israelites are going to have this very strong identification that God is going to come back. God is going to put things to right, which means their definition is that Israel will be in control and Israel will be reigning over all the other countries. They will have made that connection. And that connection is going to be one of the reasons why they won't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, it starts in these prophecies. The Israelites will connect the fact that the Messiah is from the house of David, and all of these other prophecies that the Messiah will be a man who, or a person who not only puts things to right, but puts Israel in charge. Okay, so we're going to see that all the way through, and I just want you to make that connection now. It's not a connection you have to make, but it's a connection the Israelites do make. So then we get to Isaiah 19, which is a prophecy against Egypt. Now, Egypt, as I said, was one of the major empires, but it was also, at this time, it was not one of the major empires like Assyria was. And when he says in verse 19:1, prophecy against Egypt, see, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. The idols of Egypt tremble before him. and the hearts of the Egyptians melt with fear. So there, he's giving a little bit of throwback to when the Exodus happened and the Egyptians had to lose the Israelites, and the gods of the Egyptians were defeated by Jehovah God. And dropping down to verse 16. And that day the Egyptians will become weaklings. They will shudder with fear at the uplifted hand that the Lord Almighty raises against them. And the land of Judah will bring terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom Judah is mentioned will be terrified because of what the Lord Almighty is planning against them. So again, God, in the day of the Lord, when the Lord comes back, he will put everything to right, but Judah is going to be the main power. And that's what's prophesied in here. Then down to verse 23. Again, in the day of the Lord, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. The Assyrians will go to Egypt, and the Egyptians to Assyria. The Egyptians and Assyrians will worship together. In that day Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. So in that part of the prophecy, Isaiah is saying that Israel, Assyria, and Egypt will be on equal terms. Okay, but that's not what the Israelites are going to hear. What the Israelites are going to hear is the Israelites are going to be in charge over the Assyrians and the Egyptians. So I'm going to stop there, see if anybody has any questions before we keep moving on. Okay, then we will go to chapter 20, Isaiah 20. And this is, Isaiah is going to step out of his prophecies now. And he's going to describe a time. In the year that the supreme commander, sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and attacked and captured it. At that time, the Lord spoke through Isaiah, son of Amos. He said to him, Take off the sackcloth from your body and the sandals from your feet. And he did so, going around stripped and barefoot. So he's setting a time and place when God sends a new revelation to Isaiah. And Ashdod, I'm sure you will remember, was a Canaanite city in the plains of Israel at that time. It was formerly a Philistine servant. Then the Lord said, Just as my servant Isaiah has gone stripped and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and portent against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away stripped and barefoot the Egyptian captives and Cushite exiles, young and old, with buttocks bared to Egypt's shame. Those who trusted in Cush and boasted in Egypt will be dismayed and put to shame. So again, the Lord is going to come and take control of everything. He continues that with another prophecy against Babylon. And so you can see that one by one, and sometimes more than once, Isaiah is just going through the different people who had tormented Israel, the different countries who've been tormented Israel. And he goes through that through chapter 21. And he's talking about, let's go to verse 6. This is what the Lord says to me, saying to Isaiah, Go post a lookout and have him report what he sees. When he sees chariots with teams of horses, riders on donkeys or riders on camel, let him be alert, fully alert. And the lookout shouted, Day after day, my Lord, I stand at the watchtower. Every night I stay at my post. Look, here comes a man in a chariot with a team of horses. And he gives back the answer, Babylon has fallen. All the images of its gods lay shattered on the ground. So what does that sound like? Anybody think about another place where it says Babylon has fallen, Babylon has fallen? Revelation, when we read that, talked about virtually that same wording, when Babylon falls. Then still in chapter 21 and verse 11, he goes to prophecy against Edom. So Edom is the country south of Moab, still a neighbor of Israel, and another one that David conquered. Then in verse 13, a prophecy against Arabia. So Arabia is the desert to the east of Moab and Edom and south of Babylon. So that would be the Arabian desert there. And he keeps talking about the Lord, the God, is going to basically take over all of them. So he's talking. So up to chapter 21, he's talking about what's going to happen to the enemies of Israel and the enemies of Judah. And then he switches gears in chapter 22. Now he's going to talk about a prophecy against Jerusalem. So now he's talking about God's people in chapter 22. And the Valley of Vision is talking about Jerusalem. And it's going to be a tough time, a tough time for Israel. Down to verse 5. The Lord Almighty has a day of tumult and trampling and terror in the Valley of Vision, a day of battering down walls and of crying out to mountains. So Jerusalem is going to go through a very, very tough time. And he gives them a little idea of why their problem is going to be a problem. In verse 10, you counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall. You built a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to the one who made it, or have regard for the one who planned it long ago. So Judah and Jerusalem are problems because they're trusting in their own strength, not in the strength of the Lord. That's what those verses are about. So it will be a tough time for Jerusalem. Then in chapter 23, he takes up another prophecy against Tyre. So Tyre is the area north of Israel on the coast. Tyre was a very wealthy country, small but wealthy, and it also included the area where Tarshish was, which is later, that's where Paul's from, is Tarshish. So when he says in verse 1, wail, you ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is destroyed and left without house or harbor. From the land of Cyprus, word has come to them. So he's shutting down, and then Sidon is right by Tyre. In verse 4, be ashamed, Sidon, and you fortress of the sea, for the sea has spoken. I've neither been in labor nor given birth. I've neither reared sons nor brought daughters. When word comes to Egypt, they will be in anguish at the report from Tyre. Down to verse 9. The Lord Almighty planned it to bring down her pride in all her splendor and to humble all who are renowned on earth. Till your land as they do along the Nile, daughter Tarshish, for you no longer have a harbor. The land has stretched out his hand over the sea and made its kingdoms tremble. He has given an order concerning Phoenicia that her fortresses be destroyed. So these were kingdoms that depended on the ocean to have harbors for their cities to become rich. This will have been 2 years ago, but if you remember, we talked about when we talked about the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea. Caesarea was the first deep water port on the Mediterranean, and it was man-built. It was built by Herod. And the reason it was the first man-made harbor on the Mediterranean was because the sand came from the Nile in Egypt, and the currents swept the sand up the coast of Israel and basically sandpapered it, filled it in. If there were harbors, they got filled in. And so over time, all of these harbors that made these people rich were going to get filled in by sand. And especially if they were up the river a ways, they were going to get filled in for. So cities that you see that would have been rich are going to be decimated anyway at some point. And especially some of the inwards. And so in the New Testament, we've talked in the past about different cities whose harbors filled in. So that one time they were rich, and then they weren't when the harbors went away. So he's given some acknowledgement there that that's what's going to happen, and God's not only going to let it happen, but He's going to force to it. Then in verse 17 of chapter 23, at the end of 70 years, the Lord will deal with Tyre. She will return to her lucrative prostitution, will apply her trade with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Yet her profits and earnings will be set apart for the Lord. They will not be stored up or hoarded. Her profits will go to those who live before the Lord for abundant food and fine clothes. In other words, after 70 years, although Tyre and Sidon are going to become very rich again, they're going to basically be under the rule of the Israelites who are serving the Lord. 70 years is also going to be what? How long that the Judah is going to end up being being deported to Babylon. So that's hundreds of years in the future, but that is going to be kind of a sign of that also. So now we've gotten through the specific prophecies against specific countries and cities. And when we get to verse 24, he's going to talk about the Lord's devastation of the earth. And again, this is, I think a lot of it is symbolic, but this is what's going to happen in what would have been called the day of the Lord. When the Lord comes back, He's going to take it and purify it. And that's what we're getting ready to see. See, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. Down to verse 3. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken this word. And why is that going to be true? Why does the Lord have to treat the land that harshly? And the answer is in verse 5. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore, earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left. Now, probably in 2 weeks, plus or minus 1 week, we're going to have a whole lesson about why the God that asked the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites is still a good God, and the God of the New Testament is the God of love. Okay, so that's coming, and that's going to be one of the more off the path lessons I probably ever give you guys. But I think it's real important, because I've heard a lot of people, even in our time, say, I don't want to worship a God that would kill a whole bunch of Canaanites. Because in our time, that's not a good thing. The base of what we're going to be talking about is echoed right here in these verses, and I want you to see them, because once I tell you what I'm getting ready to tell you, you will start seeing it everywhere. And that is one of the main things that God was supposed to do, or the kings were supposed to do, was to bring order to countries. Okay, order was good, chaos was bad. So just remember that as a rule of thumb. Order is good, chaos is bad. One of the primary ways you get order is through treaties, covenants, and promises. Because if you can trust people to follow their treaties, covenants, and promises, you can live in an orderly society. So when God gave His covenant to Abraham, God was doing one of the most important things He could do was He was bringing order. And God being able to fulfill His side of that covenant made Him a very, very powerful God. Okay. Covenants were hugely important. What today we would say, oh, don't go have sex, don't get drunk, go do all this other stuff. That's what we would say. In their time, what they would say is the covenants, the promises you make are paramount. Everything pales in comparison to that. So when you read in verse 5, the earth is defiled by its people. That means God's holy earth, he set it apart, and especially he set apart Israel. He set apart Israel. It was supposed to be holy, but they have disobeyed laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. That's the most evil that they can do. That's when they do that. And so because of that, because the people defiled the earth, and especially Israel, then God's got to purify it. And these verses right here are just some of the very, very many verses that you'll start seeing that that's the case. Okay. Breaking covenants defiles the land and the people. So all of this that we've been talking about through Isaiah and through other prophets is because the people have broken the covenant. They've broken the covenant that God made with Abraham, and they've broken the covenants that they made with Moses on Sinai. Okay. Now I'm going to stop there. I just give you a whole bunch of information that I'll give you again here in a couple of weeks, but I was completely blown away when I started studying this subject about the importance of covenants, because I'd never understood that before, why it was so important. Nope.
Phil, when did you say that that Isaiah was a prophet? When? What time frame?
The time period of Hezekiah.
Now, isn't he the last king that ruled?
Not one. He would not. He's not the last king. He's about the last king before Israel, the northern kingdom, is destroyed.
Okay. I was confused about Hezekiah.
No, so Hezekiah, to give you a time frame, Hezekiah is about 720 BC.
Okay, well,
Saul, and so David is about 1000 BC. Okay, round number, David's 1000 BC. So Hezekiah is 300 years after David.
Okay, then how long before the people in Jerusalem go to Babylon? When did they go? When did
the people? Yeah, the first exile is in 586. So it's a little over 100 years after Hezekiah is when the people and Isaiah, the people go into exile. Yeah.
I think of when I read this, because I don't understand it, I have to admit, but I think of when Israel and Judah, where the people from Syria and Babylon came in and destroyed everything. That's what makes me think of, but that's not true.
It's getting ready to happen. Yeah, so they're going to come into the northern kingdom and destroy it in just 20 more years.
20 more.
Yeah,
okay.
20 more for the northern kingdom, and a little over 100 years before the southern kingdom. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So this is prophecies of things that are getting ready to happen, and for the northern kingdom, it's going to be devastating, right? They just disappear totally. So Isaiah's, telling them this is getting ready to happen, and I'm sure they're going, "Oh yeah, you're just a prophet." 20 years later, the northern kingdom is going to find out it's very, very real for them. So let's go to Isaiah 24:21. "In that day, the Lord will punish the powers in the heavens above and the kings on the earth below." Verse 23, "The moon will be dismayed, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before its elders with great glory." Now, a lot of people believe a lot of these prophecies we're reading do not have to do with Israel and Judah, but they have to do with the end times, have to do with in the time of Revelation when the final coming of the Lord is. So I think you can read some of them both ways, and some of them, I do agree, probably go to the end times. And when you read these verses like in 24, 23, it very much sounds like what's going on in Revelation. But with all this going on, we'll end up with Isaiah 25. So all this has happened, but what should our response be when God reproves us and disciplines us? And the same thing with the Israelites. They're to praise the Lord because he is just and doing what he wants. So chapter 25 is our praises to the Lord, and some of them are very familiar to you probably. Verse 1, Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness, you have done wonderful things planned long ago. You have made the city a heap of rubble, the fortified town a ruin, and the foreigner's stronghold a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will honor you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you, and you will be a refuge for the poor, a refuge for the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm, and shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm driving against a wall. And then we jump down to verse 8. He will swallow up death forever. Sound like Jesus. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from the earth. The Lord has spoken. And that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trusted in him and he saved us. This is the Lord, we trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. Sounds very much like the wordings in Revelation 21 and 22, when we are in heaven forever. This doesn't, to me, sound like it's Israel that is coming back. This very much sounds to me like the end times. And a lot of people take it that way. He will wipe away the tears from all faces. What a great time that's getting ready to be for us. Not long. Not long. So there we go. There's Isaiah 16 through 25. And next time we will do 26 through 35. And I hope this is helping you guys a little bit, or at least it's a little interesting to do it this way. I know we're covering lots of territory fast, but if we don't, you can be in Isaiah forever. And we've got things to do that are going to be more interesting than that, or not more interesting, but hopefully we'll tie together some more things with it. So there you go.
Well, thank you. I could never understand this if someone didn't somehow explain it.
Well, we'll get through it together. It's gonna be good. So, well,
I read something a few days ago that was just kind of a summary of the themes of Isaiah. Well, at least the writer felt that these were the themes, and it makes sense to me that what we've read through today, through chapter 25, the main theme is God is our one and only judge, and he makes judgments on everything that's right and wrong, and he decides what's right and wrong. And then the second half, when he starts talking about Judah, is about redemption, of Judah to him in this case, but those same things are really the Bible. God is God. And God has redeemed us. And so it just seems like one of those groups of ideas that just repeat themselves over and over in the Bible. I don't know if that's exactly right or not, but it seemed to kind of make sense to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the descriptions I read this last week that I really liked was that the Old Testament is about God accomplishing his purposes through the Jews. And the New Testament about God accomplishing his purposes through the church. And yet we almost always think about it in terms of our personal situation. And I'm driven more and more by his overall picture has to do with Israel in the Old Testament and the church in the New Testament. I get the benefits if I'm part of the church, but I tend to think about it the other way. I tend to think about this is a guidebook on how I'm going to get to go to heaven. And it's just not that at all. But the other thing that's interesting, as I was just talking about, to me, is the difference in what God considered to be really serious sins in the Old Testament versus what we think of them today. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, "Oh, I sinned this week because I broke a promise," or "I didn't do what I said I was going to do." Maybe I've heard somebody say it, but it's not very often that I hear. And yet, that would have been the biggest deal you could do back then. So I think we have to get our minds in a slightly different place to really get a better understanding of the Old Testament. All right, gonna go there. I hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon. We will chat tomorrow. We have Kelsey Carter as an interview. I hope you will show up to talk to her. She is a sweet lady, and will help us learn more about what's going on in the youth group, which I would like to know more about. So we'll do that. All right. Love you guys. Have a great day. Bye-bye.